listening to Give God 90, where we're not afraid of the tough biblical questions, because we will dig through the language, the culture, and the history to find the truth revealed in the words of our Creator.
I wanna see the light.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for letting us share part of your day. My name is Jerry Mitchell, your host for Give God 90, and sitting in the supervisor's chair this evening is Myra.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if that's to remind you or to remind me. Sometimes I have too much fun doing this.
Yes, he does.
There is so much going on in the world, but I want to invite you to invite your friends, your family, your enemies, because everybody needs to hear this. This is kind of an expansion on something that I was talking about not too long ago, looking at, if you remember when we did the episode called The Most Evil Person in the World, or in History, and we looked at Nimrod. This is kind of an expansion on that, along with some other things. But for everybody who doesn't know, if you visit givegod90.com, you can find all kinds of good stuff there. If you are looking for something to read to help you kind of line your thought processes up more with the Bible than you might be finding in other places, you can certainly look and find us. Tradition to Truth is the first book I've written. It's a very introductory book. God's Universe, God's Rules is the next one. Coming soon, I hope, will be Inheriting Lies. You know, even though we're at the end of COVID still affects a lot of things. And when you're in that process, when you're in that queue, you kind of got to wait your turn to get processed through the publication, all that it takes. So it'll be out soon, maybe. There really is a lot going on. And one of the biggest questions I get is, why do these things happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons that these things happen. But the weird thing is, a lot of people look at biblical prophecy and they think that every little thing has to fit with biblical prophecy in some way. And if you stretch it out far enough, it kind of does, but not maybe the way you're thinking. For instance, if you really like some of the things you hear on this podcast and you actually click on the notification or you click on the rating and you give us a really good rating, that helps other people find us, and maybe that could help someone else choose to live the way they were designed to live. Is that fitting into biblical prophecy? Well, yes and no. It is if you stretch it in the sense that knowledge will increase, and in the sense that the Gentiles will return to the Creator, but it's actually fairly neutral in the overall scheme of things, because, let's face it, you simply clicking on a tab or an icon, it's really kind of neutral, right? More on that in a little bit. But if we watch the things that are happening in the world, because people are concerned, they're worried, they're anxious, we need to watch what's happening. And if you look very carefully and you learn your history, what you're going to find out there actually are some events occurring that are similar to events from the past. Now, I'm not talking about Solomon, and there's nothing new under the sun. Okay, that's not the passage I'm referring to. I'm actually referencing, and I don't want you to get the wrong impression here that I'm going to go into some deep, very spiritual thing. That's not what I'm looking at. What I want to look at are things that are actually right out in the open. Often, these things are on a stage, sometimes on a movie screen. They might come across reported to us from the news that we hear or we read or we see. And some things, these things are so blatant, they're actually in the textbooks that our children are reading in school. Sometimes these things are partially disguised in the books that we might read for entertainment. We see things subconsciously when we watch advertising. We hear these things in songs. Sometimes we might even hear some of these things in the hymns that you sing in churches. What we're looking at are things that many of us may have fallen for, maybe some we still believe. Think about some of the things you may have seen or heard. Maybe something you might have even said. Something that replaces our Creator with something else. Now, when we did the podcast, The Most Evil Person in History, Meyer read the account of Nimrod in Genesis 10 and 11. And what began on the plains of Shinar, okay, those things are still alive and well in our world today. Nimrod, yep, I'm talking good tonight, aren't I? Mm-hmm. I'm talking real good. Nimrod was very, very brazen. Even the Bible says that he stood in direct opposition to our Creator. If you know how to read Hebrew, you understand that perfectly. It doesn't come across as such in English, but when it says that he was a mighty hunter it says in English he was a mighty hunter before God, that actually means that he stood in opposition to God. Now, he's the grandson of Noah's son Ham through Cush, not Canaan. That's important to know. Canaan was to be cursed, but it was Nimrod, the son of Cush, that actually, well, let's just say there's a lot of legends that surround Nimrod and his family. A lot of legends, all right? Most are, in my opinion, greatly exaggerated. Some are not. One legend I kind of laugh at is that Nimrod somehow inherited the skins that the Almighty clothed Adam and Eve in. And, oh, there's Carol. Hi, Carol. I'm glad you jumped in.
Hi, Carol.
I just looked up and saw that. Nimrod somehow acquired these skins that had been handed down and handed down and handed down. And these skins had some kind of magical powers. Now, that's a little far-fetched. I think that's exaggerated. Okay? Let's just run with that for a minute. Is it possible for inanimate objects to Myra's making faces, so I know what she's thinking. If you think it's possible that inanimate objects can do things on their own, they can't. Can they have attached to them unholy spirits that affect you and influence your thought process? Yes, they can. Absolutely. There's a difference there. But these animal skins that Adam and Eve were clothed in, that were handed down and finally wound up with Nimrod. That legend is so outrageous that one of the legends is that he used to dress in both of them, or all of them, or however they were put together. He put the skins around him. Now, that would have been after, what, almost 2,000 years. Do you think they were still in one piece? Probably not. That's some old animal hide. Most likely it's legend, and it has very, very little truth left in it. There's another legend that says that Noah's son Shem put an end to Nimrod by killing him. And he actually dismembered Shem and carried parts of his body all around and through the land of Shinar and buried him so that no one would be able to dig him up and have all of his bones in one piece or in one place where they could actually put a shrine together and worship him. That is not quite as far-fetched as you might think it is. That's entirely possible. I can see that happening. And the reason I see that happening is because Noah's son Shem was righteous. You know, he's later known, and there's some pretty good indication that he is the Melchizedek that came to visit Abraham. Remember that Shem outlived Abraham. A lot of people don't realize that. Shem, Noah's son Shem, lived longer than Abraham did. So it's entirely possible that Shem looked and seen everything that was happening on the plains of Shinar, realized that he needed to intervene, and did so. It's kind of strange when you think about these things being in the Bible, but they're alluded to. They're not, it doesn't come around and say these things. And the reason it doesn't say these things is because Moses, when he was writing Genesis, was writing to the people who knew the history. They had heard the legends. They knew everything that was associated with it. And it was, I don't want to say fresh in their minds, but it was as fresh in their minds maybe as the American Revolution or at least the Spanish Inquisition. So as we think about these things, not every time we tell the story about the American Revolution, we're going to go into all of the details. We kind of, I don't want to say gloss over it, but we do kind of brush over some of the outside edges of it because most Americans are familiar with it. Many people who lived in Spain are still familiar with the history of the Spanish Inquisition. And it's that way with practically everyone in every culture that they live in. They know their own history. And that's what Moses was looking at. He was kind of brushing over some of the history, but the people they were already familiar with it. They already knew it. Throughout history, though, we can look back and we can see where there have been some major events where a group of people have been, and I'm just going to say this, dumb enough to oppose our Creator. And we can often see who the major characters of these events are. Who are the major players of these events? Sometimes, these events happen among believers, right? Now, that might seem a little strange when I say, there were believers standing in opposition to the Creator. But the most famous example of that are the events that led to Israel being exiled from the land. They failed to follow his instructions. They stood in opposition. And he said, "You're out of here. Well, kind of. There was some usage of the Persians, dragging them away, kicking and screaming. But let's face it, if they'd have been doing the things they should have been doing, that wouldn't have happened, right? But not as obvious are things, like when Seleucus Nicator, the leader of the Seleucus Empire, invaded Israel prior to the Roman occupation. This invasion is responsible for the introduction of the Roman Empire. That's how those things work. And amazingly, Seleucus began to gain the most of his power after overtaking a certain area. You want to guess what that was? In 321, he overtook the former Babylonian Empire, the land of Shinar, the land where Nimrod began all of the trouble that we can trace evil in the world to today, primarily. Remember that, while Satan came and tricked Eve, and that led to the flood of Noah, after the flood of Noah, how was evil reintroduced into the world? It was through Nimrod on the plains of Shinar, where he stood in opposition to God. He said, "We're going to overtake heaven," and they began to build a tower. And, of course, that didn't happen because the Almighty said, "No, I don't think so, not today," and confused the language, scattered the people throughout the world, and that was enough. Once Seleucus, he was gaining some power and he had some things going for him, but it really wasn't until after he had that influence from Babylon, if you want to call it that, primarily the people of Babylon, or former Babylon, that's when he actually gained the majority of his power. Now let's fast forward a little bit. Well, quite a bit. The nations of Iraq and Iran were actually officially neutral during World War II. But many of the people in the governments were unofficially conspiring with Hitler and his Nazi party. When Hitler began to get that influence, that's when things in Nazi Germany really exploded. That's when things took off for him. That means that Hitler had real connections to the plains of Shinar as he gained power. That's where his evil comes from. Now, I'm not going to run through every influence and every instance in history that corresponds to this. Let's face it, folks. The people who listen to this, you're intelligent enough to go find that information. I've given you the rabbit trail. You follow it as deep as you want to follow it. But I want to emphasize that the correlation of how things relate to the people of Israel in prophecy and the influence that comes from the plains of Shinar and Nimrod and what's going to come of it. One of the ways we look is we read through the prophets. And as we read through the prophets to gain understanding, there's one that stands out, at least to me, of how drastic, terrible, what's another negative adjective I can use for bad?
Horrific.
Horrific, yeah. Look at Zechariah 14, as Myra reads 1 through 8.
The Lord's day of judging is coming. The wealth you have taken will be divided among you. I will bring all the nations together to fight Jerusalem. They will capture the city and rob the houses. The women will be raped. Half the people will be taken away as captives, but the rest won't be taken from the city. Then the Lord will go to war against those nations. He will fight as in a day of battle. On that day he will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives will split in two. A deep valley will run east and west. Half the mountain will move north, and half will move south. You will run through this mountain valley to the other side. You will run as you ran from the earthquakes. It was when Uzziah was king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones will be with him. On that day there will be no light, cold or frost. There will be no other day like it. The Lord knows when it will come. There will be no day or night. Even at evening it will still be light. At that time the fresh water will flow from Jerusalem. Half of it will flow east to the Dead Sea, and half will flow west to the Mediterranean Sea. It will flow summer and winter.
Now, that's kind of drastic, isn't it? All nations must come together against Israel. The Israel here in it is the current state of Israel and the people who are there. Now, in verse 2, when he says, I will bring all nations together to fight Jerusalem, he's being very, very specific. Very, very specific. I think without a lot of speculation, we can say that things are being set up for this to happen, right? There's a lot of nations, not just in the Middle East and surrounding Israel, that hate Israel, but there's a growing number of nations that are building against Israel. One of the things that we need to understand, though, about what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is that both of these nations currently have connections to, can you guess where? Any guesses? You want to guess? The plains of Shinar. What used to be Babylon. There's an area, if you look at the ancient maps, the plains of Shinar primarily ran through Iraq and Iran, although it included parts of Syria, parts of some other nations that we have now. Not every nation or current nation was part of the ancient world. So you've got to look at where things were and know where things were, know where things are now, to be able to plug in the names of these nations to say, ooh, wonder what this has to do. How's this going to affect these things? And when you look at Ukraine, you can see a distinct division in the Ukrainian people between East and West. Part of the people in Ukraine want to side with the Eastern Europeans. Some of the people in Ukraine who live more closely to Russia, I almost said former Soviet Union, Russia, they want to side with Russia. And it's always caused a division. And it's interesting to look at this and say, well, from the plains of Shinar, we know it's evil, and evil is willing to fight against itself if it can draw even good people into its fight. Did that make sense? Okay. You often hear two wrongs don't make a right, or you can side with, I'm not going to side with the lesser of two evils because it's still evil. Well, it's exactly what's going on in a way. You have these factions that are at odds with each other, and the opportunity now is to be able to draw or attempt to draw more nations into this so that you have set up the opportunity for more and more nations to be ready and willing to fight against the current state of Israel. I have to be careful. I want to make sure I phrase that right, because I don't want people to think that it's fighting the people Israel, the people group Israel. They're going to be fighting the state, the current state of Israel as it is now politically. Now, I said earlier that some of these things are partially disguised, but when you understand what countries are where and where they used to be part of, it sort of brings these things into some light. We sort of see something a little different happening. It's not just good and bad here. It's bad and bad trying to lure good into the fight. There's a lot of examples I could use, but the easiest way to look at this is sometimes when two bad guys are fighting, you want to step back and you want to figure out not which one you're going to help, but why they're fighting to start with, right? Now, let's go back in history for a second. The destruction of Babylon by the Medes took place around 549 BC. But it was only the destruction of the kingdom of Babylon. It did not destroy what we could consider the remaining conceptualization of opposing our Creator. See, that concept had a strong conviction by some, and it remained alive and well, and it's with us today. We see it when we look out and can see people who are opposed to the Almighty, right? We recognize it. We see it in a lot of different organizations. We see it in a lot of different religions. We see it in a lot of things. There are many, many people today, whether they realize it or not, who are standing in opposition and rejecting the Almighty. But, and thankfully, there's a but, right? If you look at Zechariah 14:9, and I know most people who listen to this don't speak Hebrew, so I'll read my translation. It basically reads, and then, after everything that Myra just read, and then, Jehovah will be king over all the earth on that day. Jehovah is one, and his name is one. That's in Zechariah 9. It really almost reflects the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, Jehovah Eloheinu, Jehovah Akkad. Jehovah is one. And for a short time, things will be tribulative, if I can invent that word for a moment. Notice how I avoided the other part of that word. But look what happens in the next few verses.
All the land south of Jerusalem from Geba to Ramon will be turned into a plain. Jerusalem will be raised up, but it will stay in the same place. The city will reach from Benjamin's gate to the first gate to the corner gate. It will go from Tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. People will live there. It will never be destroyed again. Jerusalem will be safe. But the Lord will punish the nations that fought against Jerusalem. He will bring a terrible disease on them. Their flesh will rot away while they are still standing up. Their eyes will rot in their sockets. Their tongues will rot in their mouths. At that time the Lord will cause panic. Everyone will grab his neighbor. They will attack each other. The people of Judah will fight in Jerusalem. The wealth of the nations around them will be collected. There will be much gold, silver, and clothes. A similar disease will strike the horses, mules, camels, and donkeys. All the animals in the camps will have the disease.
Now, some of you might not recognize what that is. Zechariah had no idea what he was looking at. But today we know exactly what this is. This is radiation. It's a description of what happens when a nuclear weapon is detonated. The people who look at it have their eyes basically melt in their sockets. The skin falls off. The ones who are farther away, it's exactly what he's talking about. It's exactly what he's talking about. And because of the hair on the animals giving them a little bit of protection, it doesn't happen to them until later. The time between the destruction of Israel and the beginning of the reign of the Messiah, that many believe is that 10-day period known as the 10 days of awe. As the bowls of wrath are actually poured out on the earth, we see a punishment delivered that is far worse than the flood of Noah. Noah's flood destroyed all of creation as it was known. But this will bring mankind to the very brink of destruction. It will, it's not going to destroy or harm true believers who remain faithful. But the reality sadly remains that even this will not convince some of the people who are truly convicted to call what I call Nimrodism, because some will still oppose the Creator. Their punishment is basically starvation. No rain on their land, right? That means no crops, that means no food. Now realize that starvation is a very slow and agonizing way to die, and it just sounds harsh. But the thing is, in all the time that it takes to starve someone to death, think about this. It gives that person who is starving a great deal of time to repent. Doesn't it? Did you ever think about it that way? When the longer it takes you to suffer, the more you have to go through, the more time you have to repent. The Almighty's willing to give everybody every chance that He can think of, every opportunity, even those who are willing to stand in opposition to Him. I also mentioned that we can see evidence of Nimrod's influence all around the world today. It's in our advertising. It's in the logos of some brands that we use every day. We can't get away from it anymore. Well, any more than you can avoid yeast, right? The leavening. Because you can't get away from yeast. Yeast is everywhere. It's even in the air we breathe. And if you think I'm exaggerating, did you realize that people used to capture wild yeast? You ever heard of sourdough starter? if you're familiar with it and you know how to begin it, it's basically a way to capture wild yeast. And all you do is basically throw a little flour and some other stuff together, and you put a rag over the top, and you let it sit. I almost said let it rot, but you let it sit, and it begins to ferment. The brand logos that we see all around us, brands like Mercedes, Nike, Toyota. And here is one that you probably never thought of. If you're familiar with Mazda cars, Mazda, the name Mazda is actually synonymous with Zoroastrianism or Mazda, which are the names of the religions that began, guess where? On the plains of Shinar, at the Tower of Babel. Now, modern Zoroastrianism is a little different, but that's where it began. There's no way to avoid the influence of evil in your life. You can't get away from it anymore. You can get away from leavening. And if you really understand that, then you understand where Yeshua was talking about a little leaven spoils the whole loaf, right? There's no way to avoid it all. You can't get it all out. And that's why it's so very, very important and even crucial and critical, and however many other words I can come up with to convince you that you have to choose to live a lifestyle that actually reflects the way you're created and designed to live. Because that's your ultimate protection. An empty and meaningless, broken promise in prayer that you make out of desperation or exasperation, that's not going to protect you. Following the useless and empty doctrines and traditions of a religious system, no matter how well-intentioned, that's not going to protect you. The only thing that's going to protect you from all of this bad stuff, these bad influences, all of the evil that's out there that you're surrounded with every day, the only thing that's going to protect you is you displaying to your Creator that you're doing the best you can to follow His instructions and live the way you're designed, live the way that He designed you to live. That's what offers you that protection. When you watch or read or hear the news from around the world or around the corner, down the block or down the street, there's a litmus test that you can use to determine what it's all about. Here's what it is. You look at the situation, you look at the events, you look at who's involved, and you say, where can I find the Spirit of our Creator in this situation? If you can't find that, you say, okay, where is the unholy spirit of rejecting our Creator in this situation? But be careful that you don't jump to conclusions, because sometimes we need for an event to end before we can determine it if it fits one way or the other. And not everything is going to have a reaction like that. When you take litmus paper and you put it in different things, right? You expect it to change colors. But sometimes, if it's whatever you're testing is perfectly neutral, if it's balanced, if its pH is 7, the paper doesn't change color. It's because that medium that you're putting that paper in is neutral. And sometimes we find things that are just neutral. Sometimes Well, let's face it, sometimes people just do dumb stuff, right? And although it might seem, either wonderful or it might seem terrible, sometimes things are, for lack of a better way to say it, just things. But sometimes we can determine how an event is supposed to be measured one way or the other. If we just simply either look for where the Spirit of the Creator is working, or where the unholy spirit of evil is working. The end of Zechariah's prophecy reads this way.
At that time the horses' bells will have written on them, Holy to the Lord. The cooking pots in the temple of the Lord will be like the holy altar bowls. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord of heaven's armies, and everyone who offers sacrifices will be able to cook in them. At that time there will not be any traitors in the temple of the Lord of heaven's armies.
So the people, or I should say, those who are part of the people of Israel, those who have been grafted in or adopted, have a promise that they will eat without paying for it. I hope that sounds familiar. They will be protected. Hopefully that sounds familiar. And they will have their needs met. But not just by their neighbors. They will have all these things provided to them by the Almighty Himself. Think about it. The people who reject the Almighty will have all of the curses laid out exactly the way it says in Deuteronomy. But the people who stay faithful all the way to the end, those folks are going to be rewarded greatly. Because even in that short time, the Almighty will take care. When things are terrible, when things are just tribulative, I think I just invented a new word. When things are just tribulative, the Almighty will take care of the people who are faithful to Him. As long as you're faithful to Him, He will be faithful to you. Did you have anything you wanted to add to all of that?
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you on Monday.
We will see you on Monday. I make no promises about next Thursday. For the people who have listened to us for a while, you know that we're going to be looking for a new house. And we're going to be out doing that next Thursday. So I hope everyone has a blessed night. And if we're not live next Thursday, I will do my best to make sure that one of the older episodes gets replayed, and hopefully you will be blessed by that as well. So until Monday, many, many blessings, everyone.